Hello. If you're listening to this lecture, you are signed up for my class, MLL 190, the biological and structural components of language. In the past, it's been called the world of language, and most of my lectures I'll talk about the biological components, I'll talk about the structural components, but I'll mostly talk about, kind of more comprehensive world of language, what makes a language, what is a language. And I'm your professor, Professor Chung. So these are the lectures that I'll do a voiceover. So um, if you get tired of my voice, you can just skip through and see if there's anything interesting. But please note that at the end of the PowerPoint, there are discussion questions, and so some of these discussion questions will rely on some of the voiceover dialogue that I have for you in the PowerPoint. So just to go over, this is an introductory class to a lot of your linguistics classes. If you're a language major, this is a class that'll be very useful to you if you want to study how to teach a language, teach English, for example. And for the most part, everyone that I know uses some sort of language one way or another. So hopefully that you'll find it relevant. So speaking of which, what is a language, right? Languages are a spoken form of communication. It could be a written form. It could be a signed form. And so think about the languages that you speak on a regular basis, or the languages that you have learned or you've acquired. And think about how that you've acquired this language. Was it something that's natural? Was it something that someone taught you, or something that you're learning? Was it self-taught? And you can begin to write about this in your linguistic autobiography, which is the first assignment that is due today. So if we wanted a more formal definition, we would say it's a form of communication that's either spoken, written, or signed. We'll talk later in this class whether there are other alternative systems of languages, such as emojis. Are emojis considered a language? And it's also used by a particular country, people, community, etc. So language is something that has to have someone else. While you might be, or there might be people that talk to themselves, or it's very hard to have a language by yourself, to speak in a language by yourself. And that's because language is something that I believe, as a sociolinguist, is something that language is something that's very social, and language arises because of that social need to communicate. We would also say that language has a particular grammatical and syntactic structure, and by that I don't mean that your versus your, or there versus there. So not like the grammar nerds, or like the grammar that we were taught in school, but language has a particular pattern that a lot of people don't notice when they're using a language. Another thing that we know about languages is that they are completely arbitrary. So that doesn't mean that there's a particular word for a particular for a particular object. The language that we use to define these words are very dependent on the culture that we live in. So, for example, this dog might be considered different languages, right? Or might be considered a different word in each language. So, for example, in English, we would call it a dog. In Chinese, we would call it a gao. In Spanish, we might call it perro, right? And so there's different words for different objects, but it all depends on the different signified signs that we all are imbued with. Sign language. Sign language is something that is a particular language because it's not miming. It's a particular form that people have communicated and developed over the years to form a system of signs that are regulated. So it's not that we have just random words for different objects, but these words are something that is very different depending on what language that you speak. There's nothing inherent about a dog that says, I'm a dog. So this video kind of shows you the differences about different languages.
Ik ben Cheski. Ni sentus ni saskinte hier.
Kaikan hanapagi haichike ngat hanapna unagi haichike tsire pa nisija hanapna prek gaun orose grek muchiste girasa nause grek.
And I found that they quite liked it, and that was really quite strange. I thought they would find it awful queer. So I wrote more and enjoyed doing that. And as time's gone on, I'm writing more and more. I would say now I write about half and half, maybe even more as half.
Aí pau aí tinha gaba kai aqui o pai dia aqui foi que grade aí lo que Daniel
Wayo Materu, so hot you on shots. On you and ye, Tarai.
Ich bin 6-mal nördlich von Friedrichsburg geboren. Zu der Zeit waren normale Kinder noch zu Hause geboren.
O mam o Tiski Cernivicin Class o Nos, ha hi rwg dy chwanes tre ha disgi ddim, hag o broder the gays yn ie.
Di hi shvoni hi von san dumsa, is as kunte hiri me o húchas, tef modern dangan, Maria, Nakabalin Naul.
Todo ham, Zani Manaluhu, Mamapoksai, Ita Jedidu, Zenila, Haget, Zan Sanarita.
Mi sentus min pli komfortaj kun la lingvo, kun Esperanto, kaj estus poste pli facila por ni.
So some of those languages are very unique. So it's like 10 unique sounding languages, right? So one of them was a Silbo Gomero that's spoken, it's a whistling language that they showed it, spoken off an island off Spain. But yeah, so a lot of my Spanish students can say that they can understand this whistling language because it has like, it's like Spanish, but it's like you're whistling almost. So if you're a native Spanish speaker, maybe you can tell me whether or not you can understand that language. Another unique sounding language that they showed was Esperanto. So Esperanto was the last one, is a completely invented language, and it's made by people who wanted to reunite people and say, okay, well, we don't want this barrier, right? Like English is such a hard language to learn. Chinese is such a hard language to learn. We don't want this barrier between people, so let's try to figure out if we can create a language that has all these different roots. So Esperanto has about 2 million spoken speakers who speak it, and not as a first language. But it's kind of slow. It has this very slow kind of uptake, especially in the Americas, especially in North America. And we'll talk about why later. And some of these other languages, you may notice that it says like, oh, U.S. government, banned this language, or this language, is dying, but it's coming back. And that's true for a lot of different languages, like Gaelic. These languages are something that has been repressed for a number of years, because language is essentially a part of people's identity, and the government control over a language is how, many languages get decimated over time. But language is something that's very inherent to, people's sense of self-worth, and so these languages are facing some sort of comeback. So we'll skip over the next video, because this is talking about the Xhosa language, which was just like the first language that it showed, which was like this click language, and it's used in lots parts of Western Africa. And these, it might sound a little bit different, but these are actual full-fledged languages, because they are used as a sense of communication. And this is also a video about Silbo Gomero, which is very, very, very interesting if you ever have a chance to hear it. And then there's other languages, other tribes, other cultures, which we have no idea. We have no idea about, what kind of languages that they speak. So in the past, people who study language, linguists, would go into different communities, and they would try to document the differences between their languages, and try to figure out, oh, does this language have words for color? Does this language, can they count up to 20? Can they say yes or no, right? So there's been other tribes, other communities, which we have no idea what languages they speak. And this is a portrait of the Sentinelese tribe. And the reason why we don't know anything about their language, they're like an isolated community off of India, is because they won't let us on the island. So every time an explorer or traveler comes to their island, the natives automatically kill them. So they shoot bows and arrows, or they stab them, There's only been one person who has made it successfully alive, and then even they tried to attack them. So we have no idea what what kind of languages that they speak, but we probably would die trying to figure it out. But that's what linguists have done in the past, is try to say, okay, well, what are some similarities between my languages and your languages, and why do we have a need? Why does this language arise? Why do we have a need to communicate? So I kind of already answered my question, like what is a linguist and what does linguists do, right? But in the past, linguists have gone on to these different, kind of like kind of like an explorer, Indiana Jones kind of character, like would go like as an anthropologist and study other communities. But in the recently linguists have kind of developed this new understanding of language within our own local communities. So, for example, instead of studying different tribes and other languages, we can just study, our present and talk about what exactly, how do people actually use language and why.
But isn't it un-American and wrong to discriminate against people based on their religion?
But Jimmy, the problem, I'm for it, but look, we have people coming into our country that are looking to do tremendous harm. You look at look at Paris. Look at what happened in Paris. I mean, these people, they did not come from Sweden. Okay, look at what happened in Paris. Look at what happened last week in California with 14 people dead, other people going to die. They're so badly injured. I mean, we have a real problem. There's a tremendous hatred out there, and what I want to do is find out you can't solve a problem until you find out what's the root cause. And I want to find out what is the problem, what's going on, and it's temporary. I've had so many people call me and say thank you. Now, if you remember, when I did that a week ago, it was like bedlam. All of a sudden, and you watch last night, and you see people talking, they're saying, well, Trump has a point. We have to get down to the problem. The people that are friends of mine, they called, they said, Donald, you've done us a tremendous service because we do have a problem, and we have to find out.
Those may have been crank calls.
One of the things I find fascinating about Donald Trump is the way he uses language differently than other candidates for political office, especially President of the United States. Whereas his opponents and the political class in general seem hyper-aware that their words will be picked apart and used against them, Trump willfully disregards this fact. As a lifelong salesman, he has a huckster's knack for selling a feeling, even if the ideas and facts that underscore it are spurious, racist, or just plain incomprehensible. So I thought it would be illuminating to look at a Trump answer to a simple question. In this case, Jimmy Kimmel asking Trump whether or not it's wrong to discriminate against people based on their religion, referring to Trump's proposal to temporarily ban all Muslims from entering the United States. This 220-word, exactly 1-minute answer displays, I think, a range of the things that Trump uses all the time in his speech. The first thing to note is how simple this language is. Of the 220 words, 172, or 78%, are only one syllable, and often they come in a rhythmic series like a volley of jabs, ending with one of his buzzwords.
We have to get down to the problem.
39 words, or 17%, are 2 syllables long. Only 4 words have 3 syllables, 3 of which are the word
tremendous, tremendous, tremendous.
And just 2 words are 4 syllables long. California, which he's forced to use because it has less syllables than San Bernardino, and temporary, which he swallows.
And it's temporary. I've had so many people.
This breakdown fits with the study done by the Boston Globe that put all 2016 presidential candidates' announcement speeches through the Flesch-Kincaid readability test to determine their respective grade level rankings. Donald Trump's speech came out at a 4th grade reading level. Now, for reference, Ben Carson came out at 6th grade. Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush were speaking at an 8th grade reading level. And Bernie Sanders was way up in high school, a sophomore to be exact. Now, this isn't only down to word or syllable choice, it's about sentence construction too. Trump favors simple sentences like,
We have a real problem. There's a tremendous hatred out there.
Rarely does he use complex sentences or independent clauses. He also favors the second person a lot of the time, addressing listeners directly with commands.
Look at Paris. Look at what happened in Paris. Look at what happened in Paris. Look at what happened last week in California.
Or implicating us in what he's saying as if we've already agreed.
And you watch last night and you see people talking.
He's really good at this, at framing negative response as an overreaction that was subsequently realized as such.
If you remember, when I did that a week ago, it was like bedlam. All of a sudden, and you watch last night and you see people talking, they're saying, well, Trump has a point. We have to get down to the problem.
Maybe the most important technique Trump utilizes, and he does this more than anyone I've ever heard, is ending his sentences with strong, punchy words. A lot of times he'll rearrange the beginning of a sentence awkwardly so that he can end strong. For example, here, it would probably be more natural to say, you can't solve a problem until you find out what the root cause is. But he brings the is forward to end on root cause. He does the same here. And it looks like that's what he was about to do at the end before Kimmel cuts him off. These final words are crucial for Trump. They're pointed and taken together sketch the theme of the entire answer.
Arm, dead, died, badly injured, problem, root cause, thank you, bedlam, point, problem, service, problem.
In some sense, it's these words that audiences remember, especially when the rest of his speech is incoherent.
So, very interesting, right? How Trump answers a question. And you may ask yourself, is this intentional? Is this something that he means to do, right? He says that he's a salesman, so this is something that he might be trained on. This could also be the way that he talks. But nevertheless, we find it to be very effective. We find that ending your words in a strong, punchy way, or rearranging your sentences, or picking certain words. These are all ways in which people use language to have some sort of control over others, or try to manipulate others, or try to even evoke some sort of feeling, and not like in a bad way. It's how people even if you look at ads, this is exactly how Trump and a lot of different politicians, every politician uses language in this way. So linguists, instead of studying other foreign communities, we can just look at our own community and say, okay, this is how language kind of intersects with power. And there's more videos about how Trump answers the question. Right. So what are some other ways in which linguists can study language? Well, we can see if you're a big fan of Disney, or if you're a big fan of like the Disney conglomerate, which is everything nowadays. We do language research into, okay, what are some ways in which Disney might be revealing some ways about gender, or about how females use language. And so they did a study in which they took the older Disney movies, and then the movies in like the early 1990s, so like my generation, and then they did the more recent movies, and they try to see whether or not based on the percentage of the words that women would say versus the words that men would say, and say whether or not that this film was more male dominated or more female dominated linguistically. So they found in the older movies like Snow White, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, like no surprise, most of the words that they said were probably female dominated. And then it's very surprising that in the beginning, even though they were female dominated, that the words that women would say in the early 90s and the late 80s were less likely to be female dominated, were more likely to be male dominated. And then we see this revival in the more recent films where there are more female speakers. And so we're able to kind of pinpoint, okay, so this is maybe a more modern film, maybe a more female-oriented film, just based on the language alone. And then if you look at the speaking roles, even though that females had more more female-oriented dialogue in older movies, there were more speaking roles for males in the early films versus the ones in the later 90s and the early 80s. And then in the more recent films, the males tend to have twice as many speaking roles than the females do. Even if you take something like Frozen, there are a lot of female roles, but or a lot of, it's a very female-oriented film, but we see that the number of speaking roles often go to men. And some of this might be biased. So for example, Aladdin, Aladdin is about Aladdin, so of course there's going to be more speaking roles for the males. But it's very interesting to see kind of the breakdown about what sort of speaking roles there are. Also, there might be critiques. For example, if you are a big Disney fan, you might notice that a lot of the male characters, especially like Beauty and the Beast, the male characters, even though they have more male characters, they're all kind of portrayed as like, very macho, not very intelligent, right? So it might be less the focus on the speaking roles and more focus on the kind of amount, like what is the purpose of these roles and, how are these roles portrayed? But we do see that, in the past where females are, what do they talk about when they talk about females? Are they talking about their appearances? Are they talking about their skills? And in the classics, Snow White, Cinderella, we see that they focus more on the appearance and their skills. But then there's been a resurgence of during the Renaissance, talking about, this is during the Mulan era. Like, she's very, very prominent. She's very, she's still very skillful, talking less about her appearance. And then the new age, the new movies are more likely talking about their skill and less likely talking about their appearance. So investigating not only what the percentage is of, males versus females, not only what kind of roles they have, but also how do they talk about gender. Some linguists study today, and it might be very different again than going out to different tribes and studying their languages. And then also I got this a message from a former student. He said maybe one of your students will catch the next big threat. So the Unabomber, they said that linguistic work was pivotal in the capture of a Unabomber. And so the Unabomber, more than 17 years ago, this guy was, threatening to bomb a lot of different buildings, and he did bomb a lot of different buildings. But what had really, they try to like pinpoint this try to sketch this map of this man. They said, well, he was wearing a hoodie at the time, so maybe he was like a younger man. But they actually figured out that, some of the language that he would write was very akin to like the older generation. So it's like if someone wrote like groovy on a piece of paper, and you would say, okay, well, this man is probably not of my generation. So yeah, that's exactly how they were able to kind of figure out, kinds of writing styles, and like compare and contrasting his writing with Ted Kaczynski's writing with the Unabomber, and able to implicate him. But also, so this is one of my former mentors at North Carolina State. So he was able to look at ISIS and ISIS recruiters in a new video and see whether or not, the English that they learned, that they spoke, or, the Arabic that they spoke was natural and so for the ISIS recruiter, he said that no, it wasn't natural. Arabic was more likely to be a second language. And he definitely was like a native English speaker. Depending on where he was probably from the Midwest, and not from the East Coast, not from the urban South. And so able to kind of pinpoint based on like one recording of the speech where he's from. And he's very, very, very good at that. Just listening to someone and not really understanding what the person's saying, but understanding where the person is from. So what do people in Maryland sound like? I was always very interested to see, since I moved here, what do people, that Maryland is such a diverse state as far as language features goes. There's Western Maryland, there's the Capital Region, there's the Southern Region, Central Region, and the Eastern Shore. And you may, categorize people from Maryland a little bit differently. But even in Baltimore, people speak very differently. So here's I think this is from a show, but it's talking about the differences between the Maryland accent.
Thanks. You look so familiar to me. Oh, I'm a financial reporter for CNBC. The hot box with Avery Jessup? No. You ever do a commercial for Overshop.com? Oh, God, I did. Oh, that was before I got rid of my Maryland accent. Does the O have it? Oh, we do. Do you O? Oh, no? Let go. Oh. Ugh, that accent's idiotic.
So whether or not you agree with that, is, a lot of people have different opinions about language. I would say that language is always something that's very different. Nothing's idiotic. But the Maryland O, right? So it's very fronted. I actually wrote about that on the Baltimore Wikipedia page. So if you want to go and look at the Baltimore Wikipedia page, you'll see all my edits. But yeah, so even during the Olympics, Michael Phelps, a native Marylander, a native Baltimorean, saying "oh," at an Orioles game or during the national anthem, gave him a little laugh, and everyone, not from Maryland, were like, "This is very confusing. Why is he laughing right now during the national anthem?" But other popular terms, we have the O's, we have Natty Bo. For National Bohemian, we have Hun. Okay. So maybe in your linguistic autobiography, you can talk about some other popular terms that people use in Maryland or wherever you're from. This is also some of the linguistic features of Baltimore in general, but the elimination of the schwa. So the schwa sound makes a. And so it's eliminated entirely from a word like instead of people saying Annapolis, they'll say Napolis. Or cigarette, they'll say cigarette. Company, they'll say company. This is the O again. The O is produced in the back of your mouth. So when you say O, the Maryland way, you pronounce it in the very front of your mouth. So you say O. The Federal Bureau of Investigation. People I heard this from the Eastern Shore, people who pronounce oil, they say oil. Toilet, they say toilet. Iron and Irish, so the R collapsing, so they'll say instead of iron or an Irish, they'll say arn and arsh. Mirror could have very different pronunciations. It could be mirror or it could be miro. And then liar, wire, and fire is also R collapsing, becomes lar, war, and fire. Leading to the Maryland Christmas joke, why were the three wise men covered with soot? Because they came from a fire. So yeah, talk about whether or not in your linguistic autobiography, whether you've heard these terms or not, or if there's other terms that you've had. I know that DC has a lot of different that has their own language of it in of itself. Like bet is something that a lot of people from DC say, and it's kind of picked up within the local communities. Okay, so we talked about language, right? So then what is a dialect, and what makes language and a dialect very different or very similar? So, more formal definition again is a neutral label referring to a variety of language that is shared by a group of people. You may think that this definition is exactly the definition used as a language, and that's very true, right? So, a lot of people think that if a language is something much more broader, much more complex, like English, then we have these different dialects of English. Like, for example, in Boston, I lost my khakis, right, in Boston. So, or in the American South, we have a different sort of dialects. But the definition between a language and a dialect is a little bit more complex. So, what is the difference between language and dialect? Some people may say that a language is what is called mutually intelligible. So that means that, whereas there's different languages such as English and Spanish, these are different languages, and Spanish and Portuguese are different languages. But, if they're mutually understood, such as like, a British person can understand an American person because they're speaking English, but it's like different dialects of English. And so that that definition is very complicated because in these, I always think that Americans are very bad with recognizing flags, but If you're not sure, these are the flags of Sweden. So if you ever go to IKEA, this is a Swedish flag, Denmark, and Norway. And so a Danish person, a Norwegian person, and a Swedish person can all speak their native languages, right? So a Swedish person would speak Swedish. They can all speak their native languages to each other and still understand each other. So even though they're considered different languages, or they're actually linguistically, they should be considered different dialects, right? It's kind of like how we would consider a British person to still speak English but have a different dialect, or an Australian person to still speak English but have a different dialect. But a Swedish person speaking Swedish or a Danish person speaking Danish can still understand their native languages. I had a Swedish person, a Swedish student in the past, who said that people from Norway kind of sounded like as if they had like a rock in their mouth or a potato in their mouth, because they're speaking their native language, and it sounds a little bit different. So why is this? Why do, even though these would be considered different dialects, they're actually considered languages? And it might be due to the fact that they're different countries, really. Like Swedes want to be Swedish, right? They say we're Swedish, so we're going to name our language, even though it's very close to Danish, it's very close to Norwegian. We're going to name our language Swedish because that's just who we are. So again, language is very closely close marker of identity, especially national pride. Here's another flag test. So if you can guess these flags, this is Pakistan and this is India. And so in Pakistan, one of the languages they speak is Urdu, and in India, one of the languages they speak is Hindi. And even though these languages are considered different languages, they're linguistically they're different dialects of each other, and it's because of the same thing. Because Pakistan and India have a very long history, a very long different nationalist history, and so they want to say, actually, this is, even though we don't want to say it's like Hindi part 2, we want to say this language is Urdu because this is part of who we are. And then you have different languages, right? Or the same language, I should say. So this is a map, this is a flag of China, and this is a flag of Hong Kong. Even though that the languages represented, Mandarin and Cantonese, are considered under Chinese, right? We would consider them different languages. Linguists would, but they would say, no, it's actually a dialect, right? So they would say Mandarin's a dialect, Cantonese is a dialect, but linguistically it would be considered different languages because a speaker speaking Mandarin in mainland China would have a very hard time understanding Cantonese spoken in Hong Kong. And that's because China, the history of China is very, very, very long and very diverse, and it's separated by different geological features, and so a lot of people have grown up under different environments, speaking different languages, to the point where they can't even understand each other. But the Chinese government is very much like, we are one whole people, we're one country, and so they're more likely to say that even though these are different dialects, these are different languages, they would consider them different dialects. So the answer is, it's all very, very, very political. It all depends. Differences between language and a dialect is very much dependent on, where you're from, what your political situation is, who do you align with, the country, the government, the powers that be at the time. So to test whether or not, you speak a different dialect, try to pronounce these 3 words out loud. And then try to figure out whether or not you pronounce them the same or whether you pronounce them differently. So I would pronounce these all the same. I would say this is Mary, and this is Mary, right? But a lot of people would say, actually, no, it's very different. For example, like these two, Mary and Mary, will be the same, but this one, a lot of people would pronounce it Murray. And these are lots. If you're one of these speakers, you're most likely from the Eastern Shore or a rural area, or Pennsylvania, even, or West Virginia. And if you pronounce them all very differently, then you'll be considered British. You have a very British pronunciation. And that's not very comprehensive and not very holistic of all your linguistic experiences, because there might be something that has happened in the past to make you pronounce it this way. So, for example, I had a student whose mom was an English teacher, and she would make them pronounce everything with like very, very enunciated pronunciation. So, for example, instead of saying butter, he would say butter. And so, that seems very unnatural for us Americans, but this is exactly how the British would pronounce it. And here are other ways of pronunciation, such as pin, pen, creek, crick, cot, water, wooder. You probably heard this in parts of Western Maryland or parts of the Eastern Shore or parts of Pennsylvania or West Virginia, because Maryland it's bordered by all these different communities. Then you get a lot of different pronunciations, especially this one, cot and cot. A lot of people say cot and cot. I say cot and caught because I'm from the South. A lot of people, instead of saying water, they'll say wooder, or pin, they'll say pin and pin the same, or instead of saying creek, they'll say crick. Even different words might have different pronunciations. So, for example, coffee. Some people, if you're from Boston, will say coffee, or New York, will say coffee. This object right here, people would call a shopping cart. I would call it buggy. Other people call it a trolley. The pop and soda debate has been around for a long time. So if you're from Maryland, you'll say soda. But if you're from the Midwest, you'll say give me a pop. From the South, some people from the South, they pronounce, instead of saying pop or soda, they'll pronounce it a Coke. So even a Sprite would be considered a Coke. So if you said, oh, you want a Coke, and someone gives you a Sprite, you're very confused if you're not from this area. And so there's lots of different links, and you can click on this link and figure out a lot more. But these linguists have done a survey in talking about, United States is so much more diverse. Like, we don't need to go out to different communities to try to figure out what they're saying. We can just study our own communities and like the different linguistic varieties. And so, what do you call it when the rain falls or the sun is shining? Some people would call that a sun shower. Other people would say the wolf is giving birth. My favorite is the devil is beating his wife, which is a very southern phrase. For me personally, I have no term or expression for this, but this is kind of shows you the different varieties of English and how interesting they are, how just like kind of fluid and the different ways that people use language very poetically. So, again, going back to the differences between what is a language and what is a dialect, I always like this quote attributed to the linguist Max Weinrich, but he always said, a language is a dialect with an army and a navy, and an air force. So it's not saying that like a dialect, that a language is like has a military. It's more saying that a language is something with power, right? So if you have power behind it, if you're a government, and you could say, okay, this is a language, versus something with a dialect is a little bit more, people look down upon dialects, and people say dialects are just like the the bastard child of a language, when really linguists would say that's actually not true. Dialects are of their own credence, of itself. And as someone that studies dialects, I would say that all dialects are created equal. So even, I always ask this question at the beginning of the year, but I always ask, what language or what dialect or what accent do you find annoying, right? And so a lot of people would say, oh, I can't stand I can't stand people from New Jersey. I can't stand people from the people from the Midwest, like Fargo, like they're like, oh no, right? Or I can't stand the South, or I just can't stand Baltimore, like how people in Baltimore talk. But the reality is, all languages and all dialects are created equal. So it doesn't mean that people are unintelligent. It doesn't mean that they're it says something about them, like, they're dumb, or they're, not well spoken, or they haven't studied English or anything like that. It's that language, you grow up in a community and you grow up with a certain language and this becomes a part of who you are. So it's very, it's hard to change. And people would say, why would you change it, right? It's very, I would say it's very, very difficult. This is something that you could do, which to try to test like where the speakers are from. So you just click on one of these links, and you would hear a certain clip.
Call Stella. Ask her to bring those things with her from the store. 6 spoons of fresh snow peas, 5 thick slabs of blue cheese, and maybe a snack for her brother Bob. We also need a small plastic snake and a big toy frog for the kids. She can scoop these things into 3 red bags, and we will go meet her Wednesday at the train station.
So yeah, so you can click on these different links and try to guess where that speaker was from. So that speaker was from Brooklyn. And try to see whether or not, if you could be a linguist and try to figure out, where are people from based on how they talk. So what makes language different from communication, right? Like, all of this dog on the phone, this parrot, these bees, right? These animals do have a sense of communication, right? Like Coco the gorilla, she can communicate via sign language. So why do linguists would say that humans have language, but these animals are just communicating, right? And there's certain factors that make language unique to humans. So for example, languages allow for open-ended creativity. So that means that humans have a unique power to create new words. So these are the words that were created last year. It's kind of outdated, of course, because language is something that always changes. But fam, bet, stamp, woke, receipts, fire, burning momentum, Harambe, savage, slay, and lumbersexual, right? So these are new words that have been created in the lexicon to try to figure out, okay, so this is something that people actually say, right? Languages rise and they fall, like slang, right? People create different sorts of slang to describe different instances in their life. And that's not something that like a dog could do, right? Or a bird could do. They couldn't just like come up with a new word and say, okay, this is a new word now. It's like fetch, right? And different words also have different meanings. So for example, there's a popular phrase that could have a legitimate meaning based on this sentence. So for example, buffalo, 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 buffalo actually means, it could mean bison from a city in New York State, which others of their own kind intimidate, do the same to others of their own kind. So this sentence has meaning. I mean, it's just someone saying buffalo like 7, 8 times, but this sentence could be understood because it is one word. Again, language is very arbitrary. One word may have different meanings. Another thing that we would say that what makes language very different is that language allows for expression of unfamiliar meaning. So when we don't understand something, we kind of use what's in our memory bank to kind of form different words for it. So part of my research in North Carolina was looking at Hmong speakers from Laos and Vietnam. So they were refugees in the Vietnam War, and so when they resettled in the United States, they had to create some words for different objects and experiences that they encountered. So for example, like chok mob, right? So this phrase, like chaw means place, kol means fix, and mob means sickness, right? So a place to fix the sickness, right? So what do you think this word means? It means hospital, right? And so a lot of you are probably thinking, why didn't they have a word for hospital? It's because the Hmong speakers the Hmong people are historically nomadic. They would go from place to place, and so if someone got sick, they would have a shaman come and kind of do his or her, I guess, kind of practice and to ward out the sickness. And so they didn't really have a place where someone would go if they would be sick, but really the doctors would actually come to them. Language also allows for production of vast numbers of combinations, or what we call recursions. So if you think about the longest sentence in the world, right, you could actually tack on more and more things to form infinite number of sentences, right? So if the longest, like I'm just taking this from Faulkner, if you took just exactly like father, if father had known just as much about it the night before I went out, and just add I think, right? I think just exactly like father, blah, 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 blah. Or she thinks that I think. She thinks that I think that. So you can always add more and more and more sentences. And the thing about language is every single phrase or utterance that you speak is very different than every other phrase, utterance that you've spoken before in the past, and we will be different than every other phrase or utterance that you will speak in the future. So if you think about this, kind of like mind-boggling, right? But if you think about that, that language is very original, right? You could say any other sort of weird sentence that you could say now that will never be uttered in the past, and it will never again be uttered in the future. And if you know about the history of linguistics, you know about Noam Chomsky, who's considered the father of modern linguistics, and he's very political now. He only talks about politics now, but in the past, when he was young, he was a grad student, he came up with this idea of universal grammar, and that's the idea that we all have these different structures of a language inside us. So, for example, if you take the phrase colorless green ideas sleep furiously, the sentence really doesn't mean anything, right? This doesn't have any semantic meaning, but it fits in with the idea that, each language has its own slot, right? So we know that, okay, if someone just said this to you, you didn't know English, you would say, yeah, that's a sentence. That sounds very sentence-like, right? Everything that you see, we know that that adjectives usually precede nouns, right? So we know that colorless and green are both adjectives and they precede nouns, and we probably say that sleep, it sounds like a verb, right? And verbs usually come after the subject, and then furiously kind of sounds like an adverb because it has the ly. So it follows the verb, and so this doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have any sort of meaning, but it all fits within the syntax of what meaning is. Right. So talking about language and whether something or not is grammatical, what does it mean for something to be grammatical? So what we think about grammatical is something that's like has bad grammar, right? Or good or bad grammar. So for example, they just recently opened an H Mart, which, I'm obsessed with. I love H Mart. But they recently opened an H Mart where my sister lives in Cary, North Carolina. And people on Facebook were like, oh, yes, that's great. And they said that idea can happen in the most unlikely places. Restroom. Which I think is hilarious. But also, a lot of people were kind of making fun of this, right? They're like, idea, shouldn't it be ideas? You just have one idea in the bathroom. So a lot of people think that grammar is something that's just like, people just make fun of. Like, haha, you said this wrong. You spelled this wrong. And so people think that, people think that they're a grammar Nazi, right? Like if you are, right, instead of your, and that's really not what grammar in a linguistic sense is, right? But a lot of people think that, the differences between who versus whom, like this clip from The Office.
You didn't prepare a presentation at all, did you? You know what? I had a really rough night, and my boss can back me up on that. I'm your boss. My other boss, Mr. Figueroa. You have another job. What I do between 5:30 p.m. and 1 a.m. is nobody's business but mine and my other businesses. Are you going to waitress? You cannot have a second job if it affects your work here. It won't. It did already. Okay, honestly, it is unlikely that I was going to figure this out anyway.
That's so funny.
Why is Daryl here? He works in the warehouse.
I invited him.
It's not a party. Daryl, back downstairs. This is the information you need.
This information here? Yeah, you're right. I don't need this. Hey.
See you later tonight.
Yeah, plans later.
Okay, bye, honey.
How long until you actually get this presentation ready.
Why don't you
Honest
do the
estimate.
presentation?
Because
I mean,
I don't
you
want.
know how to do
What
it.
I really want, honestly, Michael, is for you to know it so that you can communicate it to the people here, to your clients, to whomever.
Oh, okay.
What?
It's whoever, not whomever.
It's whomever.
No, whomever is never actually right.
Well, sometimes it's right.
Michael is right. It's a made-up word used to trick students.
No. Actually, whomever is the formal version of the word.
Obviously, it's a real word, but I don't know when to use it correctly.
Not a native speaker.
I know what's right, but I'm not going to say because you're all jerks who didn't come see my band last night.
Do you really know which one is correct?
I don't know.
It's whom when it's the object of the sentence and who when it's the subject.
That sounds right.
Well, it sounds right, but is it?
How did Ryan use it as an object?
As an object.
Ryan used me as an object.
Is he right about that?
How did he use it again?
It was Ryan wanted Michael, the subject, to explain the computer system, the object,
Thank you.
to whomever, meaning us, the indirect object, which is the correct usage of the word.
No one asked you anything ever, so whomever's name is Toby, why don't you take a letter opener and stick it into your skull?
Hey, this doesn't matter, and I don't even care. Michael, you quit the other job, you're fired here.
Right. So it's very, these are people, they think of grammar rules, right? Like, when do you use whom or when do you use who? And it really depends on who or whom you ask, right? So this is what we call prescriptive grammars, right? So this is something about a set of rules about how language ought to be. The split infinitive, like you cannot say, people tell you can't say like to boldly go because to go is an infinitive. Or if someone knocks on the door, if you're knocking on the door, you're supposed to say it's I instead of it's me, right? So this is a type of grammar that prescribes what people ought to do. And the problem with this is this doesn't always reflect what people say, right? Like other people have been taught grammar rules. I'm sure you can talk about other grammar rules that you've spoken in the past that you're not really sure. Like the differences between who and whom. Like I'm not really sure what difference is. But these are just different rules that people have made up in the past. So never end a sentence with a preposition, right? Like, where are you at? Who are you going with? Always use the S ending in third person, like he goes, right? Instead of he go. Or double negative equals a positive. So like if you say I don't never want to go nowhere, that means I want to go somewhere. Which also doesn't make sense if you think about how language is actually used. What kind of languages have grammar? All languages have grammar. When you think about the standards of language, the standards are very arbitrary and they come from different places. So it's not necessarily that the standard is based on the big cities, or the capital. So sometimes like standard Mandarin is derived from the local area around Beijing, and the written language is based on the vernacular. And so the government actually sets out to form these different types of standards and say, okay, we're going to speak in this standard. Or l'Académie in France is based on the usages and vocabulary and grammar spoken in Paris, because Paris is the capital, right? But in other countries, like for example, Standard Italian is not based on the speech in Rome, but the speech on Florence. And that's because most of the literature is based on Florence. And so the Florence is not the physical capital, but it's like the cultural capital. It's like the place where, Dante's Inferno was written. And so all this Standard Italian comes from this place of literature. For example, modern Standard Arabic, sometimes based on the literature. And if if you're an Arabic speaker yourself, you know that there's different varieties of Arabic and the ways that different people speak in Arabic may be very different. So, for example, like Saudi Arabic, it's very different than Egyptian Arabic. It's very different than Lebanese Arabic. It's very different than UAE Arabic. And so you need a sort of classical Arabic to kind of bridge the gap between different countries and different varieties. And then sometimes it's based on other reasons. So it's like, for example, Standard Spanish is not based on the speech in Madrid, but that on speakers in the north. And that's because that's where the powerhouse, that's where the richest people lived at the time, was at the north. So Standard English, what's it based on? A lot of people would say that, in the UK, it's based on the Queen's English, right? But even if you study the Queen's English, you notice that her pronunciation has changed in the past 50 years. And you'll probably notice this if you watched the Netflix movie The Crown, Netflix series The Crown, and that she's like, you know, like people, everyone, like people change and their language changes. So not only are standards arbitrary, but they are also susceptible to change. And yet people who have poor grammar are considered to be bad or ignorant or uneducated. And that's because the powers that be, the government or people who write the literature, or historically, you know, white, cis, heterosexual males have, you know, kept the standards. They've written the standards, and this is what we base standard English on. This is what we write, how we write academically. If so, you know, when Donald Trump became president, some people knows that the White House Gov/Espanol, so like the Spanish website of the White House, was archived, right? So what kind of message does this send for people who are native Spanish speaking? So right, so if that's prescriptive grammar, then we would say descriptive grammar is what Chomsky's talking about, that we have this inner linguistic knowledge in our brains that's very subconscious and is not the result of any teaching. So the language in our brain, the rules about how we put sounds, words, and sentences together. And it's unconscious because we're not very aware of these things. So for example, it's just a sentence. The cats ate cold spaghetti. We would say, yeah, it's probably a sentence, right? But is this a sentence? Ate spaghetti, cats cold, duh. And people would say, no. How do you know? And it's because different words have to fit in different grammatical slots. Why not? Or, which of these is a yes or no question? Do we have a test on Wednesday? What do you think of Kanye's new clothing line? We would say, do we have a test on Wednesday is a yes or no question. But how do you know? Aliens, no. It's because of the hidden rules that we acquire in our brains. This is also, you know, a tweet. Things native English speakers know, but we don't know. So, for example, adjectives in English have to be in this order: opinion, size, age, shape, color, origin, material, purpose, noun. So you can have a lovely little old rectangular green French silver whittling knife, but it's a mess in that word order in the slightest. If you'll sound like a maniac. It's an odd thing that every English speaker uses in the list, but almost none of us could write it out. And as size comes before color, green great dragons can't exist, because you have to say great green dragons. Is that true? Clifford is the big red dog, right? No one would ever say Clifford is the red big dog, even though both of these adjectives would describe Clifford. So what kind of languages have grammar? All languages, all dialects, because it's very, you know, if it's ungrammatical, that means that it's incomprehensible, impossible for someone to interpret, and it's a bunch of words and sounds randomly strung together. So we can just test our grammar rules. For example, a double negative equals a positive. So like, I don't want to go nowhere equals I want to go somewhere. So in some languages, a double negative stays negative. So in Spanish, no sé nada means, you know, I don't know nothing, right? I know nothing. But there's double negation there, and it stays a negative. Or in the southern United States, some people would say, I don't want to hear nothing about no Trump. Does that mean, yes, tell me more about Trump, or B, that says quiet your banter about our president, right? So even though there's so many negatives there, it actually forms, it doesn't form a positive, it stays negative. So in complex sentences, every part that could be grammatically negative should be negative. So you can't say, so you can say, I don't want to hear nothing about no Trump, but you can't say, I don't want to hear anything about no Trump, or I don't want to hear nothing about any Trump, right? You have to, every single negative component of the sentence has to say negative. And we have forms in African American English that are more grammatical, or has a more, a more linguistic sense, grammatically linguistic sense of what is right. So, for example, for people that speak AAE, they usually be tired when they come home versus they be tired right now. They would usually pick, they usually be tired right when they come home. When she play basketball, she'd be on my team. That girl in the picture be my sister. They would pick, when she played basketball, she'd be on my team. My ankle be broken from the fall. Sometimes my ears be itching. And what's more grammatical is sometimes my ears be itching. So again, they usually be tired when they come home. When she played basketball, she'd be on my team. And sometimes my ears be itching. And you might think it's very random, but actually these are hidden rules, right? The rule behind it is that habitual be has to be something that is reoccurring. It's something that is always reoccurring. And here's another rule for Southern English, but I'm going to skip over it. So really, all languages have grammars, even if they differ from the standard. So in your linguistic autobiography, you can reflect on the role of language and its functions. In this class, we're going to be talking about the different aspects of phonology, morphology, syntax. We won't get into semantics or pragmatics, but phonology is a rule of combining sounds into words. So, for example, taco, we would say in America, but in English they say taco. Morphology is the rules of word formation. So we would say this is a trump, these are two trumps. Or today I Pokemon Go'd, yesterday I Pokemon went. Syntax, if you watch a new Star Wars movie, you saw Yoda, right? So rules for combining words into phrases and phrases into sentences. We're going to do some syntax trees. Semantics are rules for assigning meaning, and pragmatics are the rules that govern the reasons for communication. So why do different people, even if they say something, it might not be right for that instance. So your assignment due on the discussion board is that you should have your linguistic autobiography. So I have mine as an example, and you want to talk about the different ways in which you use language in your everyday life, or some of the languages that you learn or are learning, and what does language mean to you. So after that, you can post that on the discussion board, and don't forget to also comment on to others as well.